Few events have left such a lasting legacy that would shape the course of history as that of Nicea. In fact, so great a watershed is this council in history that it's really hard to imagine how history would have played itself out otherwise. More specifically, the events that would transpire at Nicea would cast a long shadow on the history of the Church. However, to really understand what it is that happened at this council, we really have to first look at the events leading up to it. That is, while Nicea itself is a 4th century phenomenon, it's really the consequence of events that took place throughout much of the 3rd century preceding it. And it is for this very reason that we're going to be focusing on the theology of the 3rd century in this video. However, like 4th century theology, the 3rd century itself was also influenced by the theology of the preceding century. That is, the views of Ebionism and Docetism, which we discussed more in depth in a previous video. Now, as we stated earlier, while the views held by these two camps were rejected by the Church, they nevertheless left a legacy that would continue to have a strong influence on Christian theology over the coming centuries. And while the Church would inevitably shy away from both of these extremes, there remained a leaning of sorts in either one extreme or the other. Well, by the time of the 3rd century, we have two new Christologies emerging on the scene: Adoptionism and Modalism. And because it is these two groups that dominate the Christological scene throughout the course of this century, it is therefore upon these two groups that we are going to be focusing our attention in this video. Now, you might be wondering why we are looking at two groups simultaneously. Well, if you have watched my video on Docetism and Ebionism, you'll see that I'm doing a very similar thing here. And as in that video, the reason for placing such groups together is due to their similarities to one another. The most obvious of which being that both come upon the scene around a similar time, that is, around the turn of the 3rd century. Additionally, like Ebionism and Docetism, Adoptionism and Modalism are not sects of Christianity or even their own religions for that matter, but rather specific Christologies or theologies of understanding the person of Christ in both his nature as well as his relation to God the Father. Moreover, like Ebionism and Docetism, being that they are theologies, consisted of various groups of their own, each with their own specificities, differentiating themselves from one another. However, perhaps the greatest and most important similarity involves the driving factor behind each of these groups, and that was over the nature of the relationship between God the Father and Christ the Son. And with regards to this topic, there were really two truths upheld and assumed by all early Christians. God is one, and Christ is divine. Nobody really questioned these 2 points. Now, how they understood these two in relationship with one another, and how they reconciled them one with another, is what led to their differences. Now, I need to clarify, it is not simply the case that either God the Father or Christ the Son is divine, but rather both God the Father and Christ the Son are divine, and yet God is one. I think it goes without saying that this could potentially lead to confusion for many in the Church, and as a consequence of this confusion would lead to various views with regards to this matter. And if we were to place all these views along a spectrum with regards to how they understood the nature of the relationship between the Father and Son, then on the one extreme we would have the adoptionist position, and on the other extreme the modalist. Similar to how the Ebionites and Docetists represented the far extremes with regards to the natures of Christ. And with regards to all other groups to this question, we would place somewhere in between these two. So on the one extreme, we have the view as represented by the modalists, which emphasizes the oneness of God the Father and Christ the Son. And on the other extreme, we have the view as represented by the adoptionists, emphasizing their separation. And on that note, it might be useful to give a few details on what exactly these groups believed. So, on the one extreme, we have the modalists who emphasize the oneness of God. Well, with regards to this oneness, the modalists believed that the Father and the Son were essentially one and the same identity. In other words, it wasn't just that they were one and the same being, but rather one and the same person. That is, Father and Son were not distinct or separate persons, but rather distinct modes that God switched back and forth between, hence the name modalism. And by analogy, the modalists would describe the relationship between these persons as similar to the various roles played by one and the same actor on a stage. That is, the same guy who in one moment wears a mask representing himself as the good guy, and another wears a different mask posing as the villain. Well, in a very similar fashion, the modalists believed that God was in fact the same person acting, as it were, in one moment as the Father and in another as the Son. And in such a way, the modalists safeguarded both the oneness of God as well as the divinity of Christ. On the other extreme, the adoptionists denied not only that the Father and the Son were distinct persons, but entirely different beings altogether. Hence, the adoptionists safeguarded the oneness of God by restricting divinity to God the Father alone. However, if the Father alone is divine, then how exactly did they safeguard the divinity of the Son? Well, the adoptionists took something of a middle path with regards to his divinity. They would say that indeed Christ was in fact divine, but not divine in the sense that the Father is divine. Rather, Jesus, who was born a man, and having lived a perfect sinless life like none other before him, had thus divinity bestowed upon him from the Father at his baptism, when the Spirit of God came upon him. That is, he received his divinity through adoption, hence the title Adoptionism. That is, according to the adoptionist, Jesus became divine, not by nature, but by adoption. Now, what is most ironic here is that while both groups were attempting to safeguard both the oneness of God as well as the divinity of Christ, they did so on radically different grounds and therefore with radically different conclusions. And the grounds upon which they base their positions is where we see the views of the Ebionites and the Docetists come to the forefront. So, for example, the modalists, in their attempts to safeguard both the oneness of God and the divinity of Christ, essentially deny his full humanity in that God only appeared as Jesus, as was expressed by the Docetists. And in a similar fashion, the adoptionists, in their attempts to safeguard the oneness of God the Father, consequently do so at the expense of Christ's full divinity, as was expressed by the Ebionites. In either case, in their attempts to preserve the oneness of God, both inevitably sacrifice the full character of Christ the Son. Hence, while neither side will ever go to the extremes as expressed by either the Ebionites or the Docetists, the influences of such groups is nevertheless evident. Now, as before, the Church is going to respond by going to neither extreme, simply because both were leaving out vital elements essential to Christ's nature. However, it wasn't merely the person of Christ that was put at stake here, but also the Godhead as a whole. And what I mean by this is that while both the adoptionists and modalists upheld two vitally important elements, aka God's oneness and Christ's divinity, they nevertheless left out a third equally important element vital to God's being, and that is the distinction of persons within the one Godhead. And it is this element that we shall address in more depth in the following video. I invite all questions and comments in the discussion section, so please feel free to write or ask any questions below. Thanks.